So, Andrew, casting your mind back to mid-60s,
Yeah.
just can you take us through how you first got involved with managing a pop group and how that came to be Pink Floyd?
Peter Jenner and I had been at school together. We must have left university in '63, I suppose. And I had a job in London, he had a job in London. We were knocking around with I suppose, what were the beginnings of the swinging 60s. Listening to a lot of jazz and other sorts of avant-garde music. And then I think in the summer of '66, I guess, there was what they used to call happening at the Marquee, and Peter went to it, and the Pink Floyd did something at it. And Peter and I thought, well, we'll start a record company. And then we also thought, well, maybe we'll be their managers. And then we thought, well, we can't do both. So Peter will run the record company and Andrew will be the manager. So there'd be no conflict of interest, I suppose. And meanwhile, the Floyds still knew nothing about this because they'd gone off, they were all students. They'd all gone off for the long vacation. They came back in September, and by that time the London Free School had just got going, and they had a social night at the All Saints Church Hall in Paris Square, and Pink Floyd played. So after the gig, I remember standing in the road talking to the Pink Floyd in the sun outside All Saints in the sort of autumn evening, and saying to them, well, we'd like to be your managers. And I do clearly remember Nick saying, well, no one else wants to be, so you might as well. And that was it. And we became their managers. Now I could flesh that out a lot.
Do you remember Syd at that point?
Yeah, I remember them all.
What can you give us a little picture of the band?
Syd was pretty dominant then. It wouldn't be, to an outsider, it might have looked as if it was Syd Barrett and three other blokes. It wasn't, even then. It was, the Pink Floyd was more than the sum of its parts. Syd was the lead singer, he was the lead guitarist. In any band, that's the guy that the spotlight focuses on. And he was, great bloke. He was a good guitarist, a very unusual singer, and you instantly looked at him when he was on stage. He was instantly drew the eye.
In terms of the music, those early Pink Floyd sounds, how different were they? I mean, how much did you sort of feel, this isn't the kind of standard pop song stuff, it is nudging into new areas?
I remember going to the first recording session I ever went to at Sound Techniques in Chelsea, where later we made Arnold Layne, was a recording of AMM, which was an avant-garde group led by Cornelius Cardew. And there was a guitarist, you have to check on his name, Keith. And he played the guitar with a metal ruler and things like that, and Syd saw that. And that was certainly a big influence on Syd, of the way in which you could manipulate sounds on a guitar. And the other big influence, and I've still got the record in the back there, so with Roger Barrett written on it, was of course Bo Diddley. And the use of echo and repeat echo, and then this little gadget, the Binson Echoret, came along, which was a thing developed by the GPO, I think. It was a solid drum repeat echo device, very solid and very good, based on a metal drum rather than on a revolving piece of tape, which is what like the Watkins copycat was very common, used by every guitarist at that time. But the Binson Ecorette was more subtle, more sophisticated machine. And that just sort of opened up what could be done with a guitar. And then I think Syd sort of led that.
So he was interested in like finding new ways to...
Absolutely, yes. I think he had he did develop a new way of looking at playing the guitar to some extent. Now, there were other things going on at the same time. I mean, he was no Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix was changing the way in which you could play the guitar in a different direction. Clapton, you could say, was the sort of the classic white version of black guitar, of black blues playing. Hendrix sort of took it out in another direction. And Syd took it out in another direction. I mean, Syd as a guitarist is probably not that much talked about, but I think it's actually very important what happened, because that created a sort of a sound, a sort of a basis, a sort of a wash to an awful lot of what they did in the studio.
If you see, there's this film of them playing Astronomy Domine.
Yeah.
I think it's at the UFO Club, or Sound Techniques as well.
Tonight We're All in Swinging London, or is it that way?
Yeah. And there's this it was very obvious how completely intense Syd is in his concentration on this music. I mean, it's almost like he's playing it for himself, and he's absolutely absorbed in it. And the band seems to be kind of watching him and wondering where he's going to go next, and he's clearly in control.
Yes.
But he's also pushing and pushing all the time. It's like fascinating to see it. Do you remember that sort of time?
I think that got more and more so. I mean, I think Syd was trying to move faster than the rest of the band could, and that at the end of the day was why everything went wobbly. In as much as Syd was impatient in a way, artistically. He wanted to move on. I mean, he was zooming. And his guitar playing was changing, his attitude to things were changing, his songwriting was changing. I mean, there's a big difference between Candy and a Currant Bun and Bike, say. Both written within a year or so of each other, but an enormous development. And yes, Syd was perhaps even then beginning to go sort of into himself, so that you did have to follow him. But yes, you'd see them playing at UFO and Syd be there in the middle of the stage, and if he didn't do anything, then the band would have to try and find something to do, and oh God, here comes Rick with a good long solo on the mighty Farfisa. And then you'd wait for Syd to come back again. I mean, Rick was very important because that was the other lead instrument. So that if there was nothing on those long improvised gigs, if there was nothing happening on the guitar, then Rick was always there, playing something interesting on the Farfisa.
It seems to me there's two developments. One is the instrumental side that you talked about, the guitar, but then the other side is the songwriting. And it seems like he made huge leaps. I mean, you mentioned that the difference between Candy and Currant Bun and Bike. I mean, Arnold Layne, is actually a wonderful, different kind of pop song.
Yes. I mean, I can't think what else was in the charts. I'd love to see what else was in the charts the week that Arnold Layne came out. And I think you'd say that Arnold Layne was from another world compared with what was going on around it. It was completely unconventional. But everyone around, see, Joe Boyd produced Arnold Layne. And he, as I say, was involved in things like AMM. I mean, he had a very classic music background. I think he first came to Europe as Stan Getz's tour manager. So he was very well educated musically, very well educated. But no one was trying to keep it within the confines of the music business. So Arnold Layne was able to happen because Syd had written it, because the Floyd were there. That's the primary reason. But because there was no one around the Floyd saying, no, you can't do that. You see, that was the thing. There was no one saying, you can't do that, you've got to do this. And that was the great thing, I think.
There's a freedom to...
Yes, there really was freedom. They could do that. They could argue it amongst themselves as to whether that was the right thing to do or not. But once they decided what to do, they could do it. There was nothing to stop them.
Why was Arnold Layne so unconventional?
Well, it's about a guy who nicks underwear off washing lines, which was a pretty unusual lyric for those days. And I don't know. I mean, I listened to it not so long ago. Sounds absolutely fantastic to me. It just leaps out of the speakers. It's just fresh. It sort of says, here we are, you know. The most obviously unconventional thing about it was the lyric, and as a result of which it was banned not by the BBC but by pirate radio. All the pirate ships wouldn't play it because at that time they were anxious to look respectable in the hope of getting licenses and becoming legit. So they wouldn't play it. They said, oh. Everyone knocked Arnold Layne. Pete Murray. What an arsehole. Pete Murray on Jukebox Jury said, you know, something along the lines of, the public will not be fooled by this rubbish, whatever. It isn't a very unusual song, and it got to 21. We spent a couple of £100 trying to buy it in the top 20, but we only got it to 21. But not bad. So we were learning fast as managers. We found out where to go to get your records brought into the chart, so we were getting quite professional by then.
Pause, cut. Now, folks, we're on...
Right, where are we?
We're on take 3. So you've got this period where suddenly you've got a pop band and they're actually in the charts.
Yeah.
Was there a kind of conflict going on there between, like, a band that's sort of experimental and developing and got a bit of a genius in it, and, you know, the need for chart records?
I think where the conflict really started to show was not really so much with records. Until we signed with EMI, we'd really had nothing to do with the music business at all. We were out there on our own. Once we'd signed with EMI and we had an agent, Brian Morrison, the Brisey, and Steve, who later became their manager, were booking out gigs. That's when we really started to feel, in the band especially, personally, the conflict between what Pink Floyd was meant to be about and what the realities were. I mean, they went out and did the same sort of gigs as every other band was doing at that time. Dunstable civic rooms and etc., etc. And it was a nightmare. They hated it. And that was when you really saw the conflict between the traditional pop business and what the Pink Floyd were trying to do. And that really got to them, and that, you know, they really hated it. And in retrospect, we shouldn't have done it. We should never have done those conventional gigs. But we needed money. We had a very small advance from EMI. I think we had £5,000 from them, which even in those days wasn't very much. And we had to buy vans and all the rest of it. and we were running this light show which cost a fortune, ate up money. So we really had to gig to put money in people's pockets. Peter and I were paying ourselves 30 quid a week, I think. I think we were all getting paid 30 quid a week. Or maybe even less. So we had to do the gigs for the money, and that's when, the brutal truth of what we got ourselves involved in started to come home. That didn't spill over into the studio until after See Emily Play. After See Emily Play, the pressure started to build for another hit single, and then things really started going wobbly. And that was our other big mistake, that we felt that we had to come up with another hit single. And yes, we were right in a way. It would have been great if we had come up with another hit single, but we were wrong in a way. We should have just, in retrospect, if we just turned our backs on that and regarded Arnold Layne as just an anomaly, it would probably be much better for them. And in the end, that's what Roger made them do. He made them forget hit singles. They did have a hit single later on with Money, but again, that was incidental. It wasn't part of the plot.
See Emily Play actually reached number 6 in the
I thought
charts.
it got higher than that.
Did it?
I thought it got to 4 or 5. Can't remember.
Right.
Anyway.
But it certainly, it was up there.
Oh yeah.
Being played a lot and top
Probably
of the pops.
Pete Murray liked it by then.
Yeah. So then you had Pink Floyd on Top of the Pops.
We did indeed. 3 weeks running.
How did Syd take that?
Not too well. It was... that's when the shutters came down. By the time we'd done the 3rd week on Top of the Pops, it was all over, really. I think. That was sort of an intensified version, if you like, of what they'd been experiencing in these gigs on the road. Being pelted with pennies at Dunstable Civic Rooms, whatever it was. Top of the Pops, again, felt that we were, all getting sucked into something which we didn't really subscribe to or feel part of. We were not at ease in conventional pop business situations. And Syd was particularly not at ease. I could sort of put up with it. I could shuffle along and, sort of grin and bear it. And so could the rest of the band. And to some extent, the rest of the band were going to put in the effort to dominate it and not let it get them down. But to Syd, it clearly felt wrong. It just felt wrong. And that he wasn't going to be able to get across what he felt he was about in the context of something like Top of the Pops. So we did it, I think it was 3 weeks running, and there might have been a week off in the middle, but by the time of the 3rd week, Syd was, we couldn't even find him, I seem to remember, on the last time. There was this terrible panic saying, where's Syd, where's Syd? He barely showed up.
Did he talk about it, or did he just kind of hide and sort of lock himself up inside himself?
Well, he didn't talk to us much about it. I imagine he talked to other people about it, and Pip, for instance, whom you probably heard Pip being mentioned. And Pip was, in a funny way, a sort of a good influence, I suppose, because he could sort of talk Syd through some of these things. But he didn't talk about it to us very much, and I could see, I don't know, I could see it all happening, and I felt completely powerless. I really didn't know what to do. None of us did.
Obviously, Syd was experimenting a lot with and taking a lot of acid, particularly, but that was also people around were doing that too. So I was wondering was there a point when you thought, hey, there's a real problem here with Syd, or was it just like, oh well, he's just blotting himself up because the pressures are so bad, and once the pressures are relieved, he'll be okay again?
Well, I mean, do you mean, did I think if we could get him away from drugs, everything would be okay?
No, I'm just wondering, did it seem a real problem, or was it just part of the whole culture?
I think it was more of a problem than I realised. I think there was lots of stuff going down in Cromwell Road, in that famous flat in the Cromwell Road. There was lots of stuff going down there which I didn't know about. Whether I'd have been able to do anything about it if I had known, I don't know. But there were loads of people all over the place completely off their heads on every drug under the sun. So it wasn't unique. We were familiar with drugs. We were used to drugs. It was part of everybody's lives at that time. So it wasn't as if this was unprecedented shock horror. What are we going to do about the drugs? It was what are we going to do about Syd? And we knew, and I think I'm right. I'm sure we were all right that it wasn't the drugs. They weren't helping, maybe, but they weren't a sufficient condition. They may have been a necessary condition, but they weren't a sufficient condition for what was happening. The thing about Syd is that you can use him as a sort of you can interpret what happened to Syd in many different ways. You can interpret it in a sort of romantic way as 20th century Keats, dead at the age of 21. You can interpret it as the terrors of drugs. You can interpret it as the brutal, destructive nature of the music business. You can interpret it as a social failure. You can say that what happened to Syd was the result of the breakdown in communications with everyone around him. You can interpret that's what's so fascinating about Syd. I mean, apart from the fact that everyone loved him, what's fascinating is the way in which you can see what happened to Syd in 10 different ways and explain it in 10 different ways, and they're all partially true.
That's one of the very strong things that comes across in meeting people, 30 years later, is the affection still is there.
I suppose over time, to some extent, one, maybe myself included, have romanticised Syd to some extent. But for people now who are fans, he is, a symbol of something. What happened to him is symbolic of so many things. For people who lived through it, it was just devastating. And I remember thinking that, maybe Syd was the sane one and the rest of us had lost the plot. Syd was actually had his finger on the right way to go about things, and his attitudes were right, and that the rest of us were fucking up and failing. I don't think I'm doing a very good job of it now, but there is a way of arguing that through and making that very convincing.
Because
we did talk to R.D. Laing. That was one of the suggestions as to someone who could help Syd. But I'm not quite sure why. But he sort of pulled out of it. He pulled back from getting directly involved.
One thought I had just then was that so you clearly did have a sense that he needed help or needed some therapy of some kind or something at that point. He wasn't just a problem.
Oh, well, I mean, I think everyone wanted to help. It did get fairly nasty at a couple of points within the band. But everyone wanted to help, but no one knew what to do. I mean, as I say, it was that feeling of powerlessness. It was that feeling of that guy just running away from us, and what could we do about it? Not running away from us, but just sort of vanishing over the horizon away from us. And no one knew where to turn, really.
And when you said that, he was right in a way, in the way he was doing things, what were you thinking? Was it that he was so much himself and that he just followed his own instincts and so on? So, what were you thinking?
Well, I suppose I was thinking that if Syd is unable to do what he wants to do, whether, emotionally, artistically, whatever, then there's the other side of the equation is what are we all doing that's making it impossible for him to do that. Now, transfer that within the dynamic of the four guys in the group, and you can't really look at that because you've got to look at what everyone else in the group is trying to do too. So, although, I've sort of argued that there's a way of looking at it that says, Syd was the sane one and the rest of us were balmy. Looked at in the context of the group, he was clearly a problem. With the best will in the world, there was no way other than saying that Syd was a problem. He was, whatever had happened was getting in the way. And there was, even if theoretically you can conceive of a situation where our behaviour adjusted so much that it could accommodate Syd, in practical terms, that was never going to happen. So, yeah, powerlessness, really.
Sort of going backwards slightly, but you've got this first Pink Floyd LP,
Yeah.
Pipe at the Gates of Dawn,
Yeah.
Which, in a way, Syd's reputation as a songwriter is absolutely sort of solidly based on that LP.
Yes. Funny album. It's like 3 different albums sort of stuck together in a way sometimes. Power, Talk H, Bike, Flaming. Very different sorts of songs on it. And of course they didn't have the singles on, didn't have Arnold Layne or Emily, because one didn't in those days. You didn't put the singles on the album. Sorry, but go on.
Well, I was wondering whether it was your sort of sense that he'd moved by the point that that album came out, the whole thing had really moved into another gear. That you had here a very competent, very unusual songwriter, pushing the boundaries of songwriting as well as musically. I mean, you've got Astronomy Domine on the one hand, which is incredibly inventive musically in this overall, and then a song like Bike,
Yes.
which is just original and unusual.
Yes, I mean, Bike has, well, we were saying earlier, it has like that sort of plonking feel to it, doesn't it? These sort of musical phrases and lyrics just go plonk, 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 then, whereas Astronomy Domine is all about flow. I think coming to songwriting from painting probably is quite an interesting thing to think about, though I don't think I'm the person to think about it. I think there is some sort of connection between painting and songwriting, which you could probably trace in Syd. And there were two different sorts of paintings. Astronomy Domine is one sort of a painting. Bike is another very different sort of a painting. I love Bike. I love Astronomy Domine too, and in things like Chapter 11, which I remember very well, the night mixing Chapter 11, I remember very, very well. Chapter 24, beg its pardon.
Yes, Chapter 24.
Chapter 24 of the I Ching.
Do you remember mixing that?
I do, yeah. Syd was actually had his fingers on the faders. Norman had retired into the corner to look at his latest property newsletter, and Syd was actually on the mixer. I mean, the mixer was not quite as big as the table we're sitting at now. It wasn't like these sort of 100-meter mixers you get these days. There were very few. There were only four tracks, so basically there were only 4 faders and a few pan buttons and things like that. But I remember watching Syd mixing it, and it seemed to me that his fingers, I don't know, I just struck at the time. I've never forgotten watching Syd's fingers on those mixers, on those faders. And he seemed to be doing it at random, but he wasn't. He instinctively knew what he was doing. He had a lot of skill.
So there's a sense of an...
Which you've seen in his paintings as well, So,
I was going to say, there's a sort of sense of an artist.
Yes, you felt that this was an artist doing something. He was sort of, I don't know, mixing his palette or whatever you like to say. Yeah, that's a very strong image from a very long time ago. And yes, I think his songwriting moved at an incredible pace through that period. But sort of jumpily. So after that album was finished, he wrote some songs which almost seemed to go back to Candy and the Currant Bun days, like Vegetable Man, which is a song about his own condition. Vegetable Man, Where Are You? Was that ever released, or was that one of the unreleased ones?
It was recorded, wasn't it? But
Yes.
EMI wouldn't...
They've never released it.
No.
Well, that sort of musically, in a way, almost goes back to Candy and the Currant Bun. But at the same time, what's that song on the second, Sauce Full of Secrets?
Jug Band Blues.
Jug Band Blues. Which is a sort of a continuation of Bike, in a way. It's got that plonky thing again. The lyrics are unbearably sad to me, really. But it's got that plonky thing. So he was, there were always sort of 2 strands in his writing going on at the same time. There was that rock and roll strand, if you like, which Candy and the Currant Bun is fairly close to, not a million miles away from a conventional rock pop 60s thing. And then you've got these things like Bike, Jug Band Blues, Scream Your Last Scream, which seem to be going off in a completely unique direction. Very, I don't know, I suppose you'd have to call it postmodern or something. Very cut up and impressionistic and almost sort of ironic musically. And just tremendously, that's what I regret most, that that area of songwriting that he was getting into there, that never really got developed, because it was quite unique, and we'd only seen the start of it. I feel there's like half a dozen songs, and it was I think an enormously, completely unique area of songwriting he was getting into there. I don't know anyone, I don't see how anyone could come back to that. I don't think they're even influential. You know, they're sort of too unique and personal, really, to have been influential on other people.
Tell us a bit about Scream Your Last Scream, because it's never been issued. It was possibly going to be a single, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know if Syd ever did a vocal. I mean, the version I've got of it, Nick sings the vocal. So I don't know if we ever got a vocal out of Syd. Scream your last scream, old woman with a basket, wave your arms madly, madly, madly. She'll be scrubbing something on all fours. Extraordinarily sort of cut up lyric. And again, that sort of jerky, plonky musical phrases. And expressionist, I suppose, yeah. Quite unique, extraordinary songs. I'm sure that will never be released. I mean, it's around on endless sort of bootlegs and pirates. You can get hold of it, and I've got a tape of it. And I'm sure there's one up at Abbey Road. But I suppose it will never be released. Shame. There you go. 50 years maybe. When he might get bought by someone, some bastard will release it, whatever anyone thinks.
So, moving on to obviously a really tough decision that you and Peter had to take when it was decided that Syd would leave the band. You made that decision. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we didn't decide that Syd should leave the band.
No, your decision to go with Syd, I was thinking, sorry.
Well, it wasn't the greatest commercial decision in the history of the music business. And one result of that is that Steve O'Rourke is considerably richer than me. But I don't... It was very complicated, and there's still things there which I don't feel easy in talking about. So it was very complicated. It is not really, it's an oversimplification to say that Peter and I chose Syd as against the rest of the band. Yes, that's, you know, the normally accepted story. Ha ha ha, what silly boys Peter and Andrew turned out to be. It was more complicated than that, but there's still things there that, you know, you'll have to wait till you come back and do this again in 20 years before I can really talk about too much. But we certainly wanted to stand by Syd and look after Syd and do what we could, and we were able to do bloody little, but whatever it was, we did try and do. And so did the rest of the band. I mean, they were going to go on and get off with their careers, but they were very anxious, and all played a big part in making sure that whatever could be done for Syd was done. in terms of getting his solo albums made and so on.
I mean, forgetting the complications that you're not telling us about, it seems, I can see why it must have seemed a very, very logical thing.
Because Syd wrote the hits. All we'd had from Roger up to that time was, I don't know, Power Talk H. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those situations where, you know, it's sort of, well, that's not a decision I want to make. I don't want to be starting from here. Why should I have to make this decision? Didn't really want to make a decision. And the band, at the end of the day, made a decision for us because they said, we're off with Brian. They went off with Brian Morrison. And certainly Brian contributed to that. He did his best to put pressure on us. And that's what happened. So, in a sense, I would say that the band made a decision, and Peter and Andrew were then stuck with that decision, and tried to make the best of it, and didn't regret it entirely. We didn't think, oh bother, you know, we really still want to be working with the rest of the band rather than with Syd. We just felt, well, that's the way it's happened. That's what's going to happen. The band have got themselves together. Off they go. I didn't have any opinion as to whether they'd make a success of it or not. But we were just stuck. We just carried on doing what we could do. And we were getting into other things at that time. We were beginning to get interested in working with other bands and so on. So Peter and Andrew had more or less become... or getting close to becoming, you know, a sort of professional music biz management office.
And what was your experience of Syd after the split?
There was a system for a time whereby we'd all take it in turns to give Syd a meal. So we used to see Syd fairly regularly. He used to come round. I was living in Alexander Street, then in Notting Hill area, Portobello Road area. And Wendy, my wife, had a design studio on the ground floor, and we lived upstairs. And Syd would come round, and I remember him standing in the sitting room. We'd give him supper and talk, and sometimes it all seemed pretty normal. And sometimes it all felt disjointed. Wendy, my wife, had known Syd since art college. I mean, she would say, well, she's not here to say it, but she would say that it would, you know, it's the bloody music business that dished him. But we'd come round and look after him, and we'd see him a bit, and then all the time he was making the albums. For the next few years he'd be around, and then gradually we saw less and less of him.
Did you have any sense that he might pull through and come back to, you know, being...
I can't remember thinking about that. I think I probably thought, yes, he would. I assumed that things would get better, and that if he could just be away from it and have the pressure off him, then things would get better. But they didn't, and I can't remember what I would have thought about that. I just probably thought, oh, fuck it, you know. You know.
Sort of frustration.
Well, it's powerlessness, you know. Yes, it's frustration, if you like, but really, not being able to, you know, not knowing what to do, not being able to come up with something, just running around in circles, really.
There were those sessions in the studio, like the Madcap Blast recording sessions.
Yeah.
Some of which were abortive, weren't they? I mean, a lot of them were abortive, I believe.
Yeah.
Did you get involved in those?
Yeah, I was up there quite a bit, not as much as... Peter Jenner produced the Madcap, so he was up there all the time. I was up there quite a bit, but not all the time. And Syd would come and go in a very unpredictable manner. It was difficult. It did feel like he was only sort of half there, really.
But amazingly, when you listen to them now, there's still some absolute gems.
Yeah.
Yeah, in both that one and Madcap and Barrett.
Yeah. Gigolo Aunt.
Yeah.
Golden Hair, which is a James Joyce lyric. Yes, some wonderful songs on those albums. But they're demos. They're not completed works like the songs that we've been talking about earlier. They sound to me like demos. They sound to me like things filched from an artist's studio before he'd finished them. They sound unfinished to me. I think they're very interesting. But they're not quite right.
But there's also this sense of, because they have that feel, a sort of unusual rawness and immediacy about them, which is very unusual. Again, I mean, it's very.
Oh yes, and to fans, I mean, fantastic. You feel you're sort of, again, because they're unfinished works. It's because you have had a glimpse into. You get a sort of a glimpse into his thought processes, which maybe you don't always get from a polished, finished piece of work. It is like sort of moseying around in an artist's studio when he's out the room.
It's almost like he walks in and says, "Right, here we go." Does it? Whatever happens, happens. You can't do it again, and he walks out as you kind of catch it.
Yes, and that's fine. I mean, they are what they are. I would like to, I'd like to see them with Syd able to bring them to what I would call more like a finished work, because they would change a lot. They're very sort of first take, and there's lots of rough bits, but that's fine. That's great. That's documentary. I'm not knocking them. I think they're fascinating albums, but I wish they'd been proper albums. I wish they'd I wish they'd been done. I wish they hadn't been made like that. There's no way for someone of Syd's genius, if you like, to be remembered. I mean, you don't want a great artist to be remembered by sort of sketches and studies. They're fascinating, but you want to see the completed works as well.
I mean, using the phrase like the great artist, is that how you think of him?
Yeah. I think he was very good, and I do feel very strongly, as I was saying, that the best was yet to come. For me, apart from all the personal things, the most frustrating thing is that feeling that he might have settled into a groove and been able to produce a whole series of absolutely unique songs, and it's what he didn't do. I think he was a great artist, but we've never seen his mature work. We've seen some wonderful sparks, fascinating, exciting stuff, but we have never seen and never will see Syd's mature work, and that has to be a huge regret. This Listen to this. This is quite nice. So it would stand on people's desks and things. And there you are. You have a slightly psychedelic front. And you open it up, and there they are. Don't know who took that photo. But you notice it's Rog Waters. Very odd. And this dreadful spiel down the sides by me. In the last months, the Pink Floyd have been developing a total show. Explosive sound, film, lights and images are combined into a single experience. Audiences in clubs, halls and universities, i.e. where we were trying to get gigs, have been really stunned. Good, brilliant writing, Andrew. And the group has aroused a lot of general publicity. Ghastly. The Pink Floyd are opening up a new world in sound and vision entertainment.
That was your first flyer.
Yeah, dreadful, isn't it? Talking about oversell. Very uncool. After that, we got professionals in.